Any other questions? Our next speaker is Pete Stroh, Scientific Officer at the BSBI, co-author of the Plant Atlas 2020, and Pete will tell us about the making of the current atlas. Please everyone welcome Pete Stroh.
Thanks very much, Astrid. Now, I think that's it. I think that's my first screen, yes. So as Astrid's mentioned, very strange actually, speaking to the back of people's heads. Astrid didn't mention that, I mentioned. Yes, as Astrid mentioned, I've been asked to speak on the making of this latest plant atlas, and after consultation with my therapist, I agreed to go ahead with it. For those of a nervous disposition, I can categorically state there'll be no semi-naked pictures of Tim Rich in my talk. I received a rather forthright email in late 2020 by someone who will remain nameless, asking why the atlas had not been published yet. So we had all the data we required for the maps. The captions have been written for the new atlas, as in Chris, David and Trevor's atlas. So what else was there to do? So I hope that this presentation may serve to reassure the sender of that email, who must have been quietly fuming at my idleness for the past 2.5 years, that we were not sitting on our hands since fieldwork for the project stopped at the end of 2019. I will eventually start, but they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I thought I'd share with you a photo I found that was taken just prior to digging into the Atlas survey results. So here I am just in 2018, and the old man you see before me now. Atlases do take their toll. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I don't want to go into any great depth about making the atlas because we'd be here all day. So I'm sort of summarising by sections, as it were. So the first one is the survey, and the small dot just left of centre there. If you know that this person is wearing a blue boiler suit, some of you might be aware that that's Owen Mountford searching desperately for cotton grass. It's certainly around there somewhere. So Kevin's already given an introduction on the survey results, but of course at the beginning of the survey we had to try and figure out what we wanted to do and how we were going to do it. So the structure of the survey was largely based on the work of Quentin Groom, who advised, after some analysis of the BSBI's data, that a minimum of 3 tetrads surveyed thoroughly per hectare would probably result in the recording of most of the species present within that 10 kilometres square. Of course, many recorders went to significantly greater efforts, with some recording all tetrads within each hectare, and indeed, notably in Cornwall, where they recorded all monads within each hectare, although to be fair, that was for their flora. So we tried to make it as realistic as possible a target to aim for, and a refined rate of 75% was arrived at. I'm not quite sure how. I think it's just a nice round figure. So that refined rate relates to species previously recorded from a hectare, pre-2000. This was very much a guideline. For a number of reasons, this would not be achievable, even if you were to record each monad within each hectare. And of course, in some urban areas, the percentage may have far exceeded 75%, may have exceeded 100%. And there are also guidance notes written and published in BSBI News about where and what to record. Basically, don't record in gardens, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. And some of you may remember the publication that came with your BSBI News a while ago now, notes on identification works and some difficult and unrecorded taxa, that catchy title. Some of you may actually have read it, but that was based on a publication that was produced for the previous atlas, and was the first collaboration for the Atlas project with Biological Records Centre. And then, of course, we have science staff and the country officers in particular that helped communicate what what we wanted to achieve throughout the Atlas project, and there were regular-ish updates in the SBI News. So one of the things which you require, certainly in modern times, for the production of an atlas is an exceptional database. You might, for example, wonder how recorders knew when they had reached the magic total of 75% of the refined rate, if indeed that was the figure they were aiming for. So Tom Humphrey set up these dedicated web pages on the BSBI database, which presented up-to-date information on the coverage achieved based on the records uploaded to the system. And if you uploaded records within 24 hours, they would appear on this page. So you can see on the left-hand side, that is the refined rate per hectare, with the darker going to red in some cases, squares showing hectares that had a very low refined rate, and then the bright green was a very high refined rate. If you don't recognise the shape of that county, it is Cambridgeshire. And on the left-hand side, I think I might have said the left-hand side twice, but anyway, sorry. The right-hand side is that map, and on the left-hand side is it's a proxy for effort, really. So it's based on the number of recording days within each tetrad. So you can see that Cambridge has been extremely well recorded, for example. And below that, you can't see it, but you could if you were looking at the database. There was a list of tetrads by hectare broken down, showing the historic species which have been refound, how many were missing, and new species as well, and much else besides. So a wonderful resource for Vice-County recorders in particular to draw on. Yes, I can't possibly talk about making an atlas without mentioning the army, if that's the correct term, of skilled botanists. They're the backbone of the atlas, they're the backbone of the BSBI, and they've done an absolutely incredible job. The estimated 8,500 botanists that took part, I'm sure, is an underestimate. There are many records that are associated with a flora group rather than an individual. So you might have 10 or 15 people on that outing which make a contribution. So I think it runs into possibly the tens of thousands of people. And 30 million records is no mean feat. Kevin's been over the coverage. But just to say that it was Vice-County recorders in the main that organised many hundreds of field meetings. And so as well as having organisational skills to get permission for access and everything else which is involved, they also have to have the field skills. These days also the IT skills and of course the social skills. So there's this huge amount of work involved in organising a meeting and generating all these many millions of records. And I did want to point out for those that weren't aware that as well as the vast majority of people being volunteers, I think that's just about everyone, there were no subsidies for travel or expenses. And back of a fag packet calculation when I did smoke cigarettes, showed that it probably would have cost about £10 million for this survey, and nothing spent on it in terms of volunteer time. So it's a really wonderful achievement, and it's certainly a tribute to everyone that took part that we've managed to complete it, and it's now finally published. You might just see, if you're in the bottom photo, if you look in the centre, there is another photo of Lynn Farrell, thankfully not wearing a mini skirt now. Centre stage at a great Fen project. So onto the maps. I did just want to mention before we start on maps that That meadow on the left-hand side, that's a local meadow to me. It's 3 fields down from my house. And there's Silene flossiculi, ragged robin, and the map next to it. That field had no historic records whatsoever. And indeed, that particular length of the Nene Valley in Northamptonshire had no historic records because of a very obstinate farmer who actually turned out to be a very nice man indeed, after a few pints. And he allowed me to botanise the meadow. And there are any number of rare species there, both nationally and locally, including huge quantities of tubular water dropwort and Juncus compressors, sorry, I forget the English name, Carex panacea, Carex nigra, which are both vanishingly rare in our area. And perhaps the star of the show, Eleochorus uniglumis, which was presumed extinct in the county, and is there in some numbers, and also in fields adjacent to that. So the reason for that minor detour is because that's what square bashing is all about, really, in my book. It's going onto land which hasn't been explored before, or perhaps has, but finding these new species, finding the unexpected. So that underlies all the maps, really. It's that adventure in finding new. It's not just dot on a map. There's a lot of fun that goes into it, which is not the case for actually cleaning the data set, which was by far the most onerous and time-consuming task I've ever done. It wasn't just me, but that I took part in. If you consider that we mapped 3,500 taxa and 30 million records were submitted, it's not a small undertaking, hence the not publishing by the end of 2020. So we started off by, because all the records were available in the database, and it's such a wonderful tool to use, we could check. Actually, I started checking nationally rare and scarce distributions prior to the end of fieldwork in about 2018. I started that as the first run through, and then moved on to threatened species and then the rest. And the maps were visited and checked many, many times throughout the process. Because many of the records were validated by vice county recorders. We asked them to do it, actually, and they very generously did, in the main. And I think that there's an important distinction between validation and verification here. You can validate your data and you're very pleased with it, and you send in hundreds of thousands of records, but as thorough as you might be, an error rate of 0 would have been quite astonishing. I dare say impossible to achieve. And so even if you factor in an error rate of 1%, that's 300,000 records that need some scrutinizing. So we started, the first species, the first new hectad that has native species mapped not previously, and we go from there. And I can't talk about the clean data set without mentioning the many referees, many species referees which are involved with the more tricky taxa. For example, Ian Denham, who's in this room now, and others, too numerous to mention, but they were a huge help. And so after a first run through of all 3,500 maps, or actually about 1,700, because we concentrated on the natives first, we sent out queries to vice county recorders who were wonderfully helpful in answering them. And then it's a question of continuing that process for 2.5 years. So one slide, 2.5 years. Sorry, mixed in with that. So at the same time as we were checking the maps, we checked status, whether a species in a 10 kilometres square was native or alien. The new atlas did a wonderful job of assigning status to hectads for native species in particular. In the intervening years since its publication, though, many tens of thousands of new native hectad combinations were recorded. So it was our task to assign a status to these squares. It was not an easy task at times, and many different factors had to be taken into account. We trawl the literature and we ask for advice, but ultimately, I'm afraid it's editor's prerogative comes over sometimes. And in the case of the map on the top right, must learn my right from my left, that's Carrick's pendulum. That's the map for Carrick's pendulum. And you'll see it's in grayscale. And that's because for about 39 species, well, no, not about, for 39 species, including Carrick's pendulum, we just could not decide on a split between the native and alien range. There were so many garden introductions, and you could call it a cop-out, but we'd saved them till the end. We'd whittled a long list down to these 39, and it was just impossible to tell. So the distribution is still mapped, but we did not attempt to separate native from alien status. I put an example of an archaeophyte in the bottom right, which, if I can read the screen correctly, I think is corncockle. I think it is. And so that was the other problem which Kevin touched on. Trying to, originally I really wanted to separate the deeply historical archaeophyte occurrences from these new neophyte occurrences which have been sown, but it just proved to be impossible. So all were mapped as alien, and the trends analysed accordingly. So if there is one lesson to be learned from this, I would suggest that, if at all possible, record status wherever you can when you make a record. It can be impossible sometimes, but Kevin Walker and others produced a paper in British and Irish Botany which does help to a great degree. Onto the species accounts. Again, these are all close to home, all new hectad records, and all lovely plants. I won't do a pop quiz, you all know what they are, I'm sure, although the middle one has now changed its name. It's now given a full species. It's a blue pimpernel, and it's changed its name, its Latin name as well, hasn't it? Lysomachia. So, following the innovation of the new atlas to include species accounts to accompany maps, we were tasked with updating them and also writing new accounts for new species mapped. We first approached the new atlas editors, those which I could contact anyway, and gave them priority, or gave them the prerogative of whether to take up the challenge or not. Many did take up the challenge, a few refused wisely, I think. And so then it was a case of trying to find new authors to edit and edit the old accounts and draft the new ones. This was a fairly lengthy process. Inevitably, you've got to do a fair amount of research. It's been 20 years since these captions were last written. Deadlines were perhaps not strictly followed. Just to say that, you know, whereas myself and Kevin and others were paid to do this work, the 40 or so authors that edited these species accounts were not, and they had lives outside of the atlas. So deadlines were a movable beast, shall we say. But we did get there in the end. And then there was once we had the text in, there was a huge amount of editing. And then, of course, Stace's fourth edition of his new flora had come out in 2019. I had foolishly assumed that it would be possible to automate the update in names within the database, within the text. This was not the case, so I had to go through all the species captions and update the names necessary. David Pearman very kindly provided updates on altitudinal information, which had to be integrated. And Chris Preston and David also provided their ongoing research on alien first states, which significantly improved many of the non-native accounts. And then there was more editing and more editing. The second mention of the exceptional database comes because this work was all possible to be undertaken within the database itself. You didn't, well, rarely did I receive Word documents, which then had to be transposed. Everything was all in one place, which was hugely useful. Certainly for the online atlas, the transfer of information, text across was made much more fluid, I think. For Rich Berkman and others to comment on that, perhaps. It also meant that later on in the process, Tom was able to add links to each species mentioned in an account, so an additional species that was included in the text. And on the online atlas, it means you can now click on that species, which is a hyperlink, and you'll be magically transported to another species account. And references, many references are also tagged in the same way. Let's just say it was not so straightforward sending this text to the book designer. I caution against a project which tries to do an online atlas and a physical book in the future. And then transferring the thousands of corrections that were made as far as the book was concerned back into the database. Tom ended up doing that, and I will be forever grateful for him, because I'd come to the end of my tether by that point. But as a tool for producing an online atlas, it's an excellent model to follow. Okay, I'm only going to skim over the analysis, because Ollie is taking up this topic later on, and I have very little depth of understanding about it. Here's your bee orchid maps again, very popular, the bee orchid. And I'm sure Ollie will mention things like Frescalo, which is just a recorder effort over time. Happily, the vast majority of records made sense to all of us, perhaps with the exception of a few groups, including aquatic plants, where we couldn't really, I don't think the model could really account for the huge amount of effort that was put in for the last atlas relative to this atlas, but hopefully that's a future post-atlas project that can be addressed. I did, without embarrassing Ollie, who is in the room, I did just want to point out that it's all very well having a brilliant statistician. That's one thing, but having someone who's also a plant ecologist just makes life so much easier. Someone who understands the data and the results in the context of the field is a rare beast, and we're very grateful to him for all the work that he's done. Okay, on to the design. Whoever decided to produce a book in addition to the online atlas clearly didn't know what they were letting themselves in for. On the left is this book design, on the right is the online atlas design, and a lot of similarities, but it was more the book, I think, that was probably the most problematic, because whereas online, of course, you don't have limited space in the book, you do. So it's very grateful to have some brilliant designers involved in making this atlas. I almost said these atlases. I almost have a split personality when it comes to these two publications. The first meeting of the online atlas group was held in March 2020. You might remember March 2020 for other reasons, but of course the online atlas team only remember March 2020 for the first one. The product you view now at plantatlas2020.org took a huge amount of effort, and the finished product is in particular a tribute to the skills of Rich Berkman, alongside the contributions and world-beating pedantry of the rest of the team. And yes, and King Pedant amongst them actually is a man that most people won't have met at Princeton University Press called Andy Swash, who's there photographed probably in the Amazon. He birds all over the world. He's a big birder. He's also a good plantsman too. And what Andy doesn't know about copywriting and pedantry is not worth knowing. Mysteriously, Rob Still, who led the design on the book, I cannot find a photo of him on the internet, and he's fairly well known. So he's probably, I don't know what he's done. I'm not sure if I should be worried. But anyway, that's his forthcoming book with Princeton University Press. which will be a pocket guide to British and Irish wildflowers in association with the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. So I'd say about a year and a half in, started to dream maps. I thought I'd just take one example out of possibly thousands to demonstrate the level of detail that had to be thought through. So we had to consider colourblind readers, of course. The presentation of the colours for progressive date classes had to be considered. We were always going to use blue and red, I think. It made sense to do that. But of course, we now had 5 date classes to map, whereas previously in the new atlas there were 4. And it turns out that the human eye can only accurately differentiate between 4 shades of the colour range at best. So that presented somewhat of a problem for the book, which we got around by presenting 4 date classes. You had to think about the presentation of the key, which is not as straightforward as it sounds. Size of the map on the page, on the printed page, is very important. You want to be able to differentiate the distribution, but you don't want it too small or too large, because otherwise the books become too big. Although they are quite a simple size as it goes. Colour and thickness of the coastline, whether to include colour elevation, grayscale or none. All those are available on the online site, but we had to decide on one for the book. At one time we did consider not including status at all. That was quite a quick conversation. I think that was when we were at lowest ebb. Ensuring the correct map was inserted. Very grateful to people I'll mention later on for finding a few of those. And the list is endless, really. So, again, I don't want to go into this too much, as Rich Burton will be demonstrating the online atlas in a bit. But I just did want to say that when we were thinking about the design and content, we all agreed that we wanted to enhance or attempt to enhance what went before, to do something innovative. Otherwise, you don't want to repeat exactly what went before, as brilliant as it was. So, having said that, we blatantly nicked the graphic on the left-hand side, the altitude versus latitude diagram from the brilliant Bryophyte Atlas published in 2014. If you see something you like and it's useful for your production, why not use it? It's too good to use, really. But we have all sorts of other things, which no doubt lots of you have already seen on the online site and explored. But we had to think about what to include in the book, so we decided on the altitude latitude chart and the information on phenology. Of course, if you go onto the online site, there's a huge amount more for each individual species, which I'll let Rich talk about in a minute. You must have one talented artist, I would suggest. It might seem a bit ridiculous to some, but one of the hardest tasks for a publication can be the front cover. After all, despite what we might wish to think, it's undoubtedly true that people do judge a book by its cover. And whilst I was trying to decide what map we might use on the front or what photo to use, I stumbled across the artwork of Chris Thorogood. And it turned out that Chris is not only a brilliant artist, he is also Deputy Director of the Oxford Botanical Gardens and a first-rate plantsman. So my initial ideas on the design were very gently put to one side by Chris. And he came up with what you now see on the front covers. I think it's wonderful, and I can't thank Chris enough. You also require an enthusiastic publisher. Originally, the BSBI were going to self-publish this atlas, and I'm extremely grateful for the intervention of Princeton University Press, who put a lot of resources into the final book. Robert Kirk is displayed there on the right-hand side, and it's fair to say that we wouldn't have a book without him and the team involved. I could go into more stories, but I think I'm probably taking up a bit more time than I should. So I just want to very briefly talk through the final steps. That's what I felt like. Yes. So the captions were checked multiple times whilst they were in the database. and we did our best to standardise words and phrases. That information was then passed on to Andy Swash at Princeton, who checked and did a huge amount of editing and comments. And after a time, the proofs were sent to the proofreaders, two of which are in this room, two of whom are in this room, Alan Leslie and Chris Preston, David Barden being the other one. Cannot tell you how thankful I am for your input into this. Chris, Alan and David worked to extremely tight time frames. They were really assiduous. There were thousands of corrections which they found, and many improvements as well, which they made to the text and to the graphics actually. So without their help, I will be hiding in the cupboard somewhere after finding the 100th mistake. And I really do sincerely thank them for that. And then we checked it again and again and again, found a few mistakes just the day before it went to the printers, etc. But finally, after a lot of testing and tweaking, it went off to the publishers, and then we could focus on the final stages of the online atlas. Kevin's already talked about the summary reports, but I just want to thank Kevin and John Faulkner for Ireland. It's an enormous undertaking trying to distill 20 years of survey work into about 30 pages, and they did a wonderful job, as did Haf Roberts on the Welsh translation. I've tried to find embarrassing photos of the team that worked, and it sort of half worked. But I honestly can say that we never once fell out in public anyway. And everyone was a specialist in their field, and I think it was probably, I think we'll all agree, we'll look back on it in 5 years' time. I think it was an extremely enjoyable and worthwhile project. And finally, I'd like to thank the generous funders who contributed towards the publication of the book, and also the many BSBI members who personally contributed funds to this Atlas project. So thank you very much for listening.
Does anyone have a question for the audience?
If you've ordered it, when will you get it? Pardon me? If you've ordered it, when will you actually get it? Delivery.
Well, the first batch of, I think, 1,000 copies were in their warehouse, and Princeton's warehouse, and were sent out last Monday. The new batch of a further 2,000 books, because they sold out. So the new batch should be with the warehouse staff soon. So if you go onto the online site at the moment, if you go on to try and buy a copy now, you'll see out of stock on the Princeton website. It hasn't sold out, and then it arrives within, as soon as they're back in stock at the warehouse, they'll be shipped out, and it takes a couple of days. Well worth the purchase.
Just a quick question. Of the 30 million records,
Yes.
were they all specifically done for the project, or do they include other records that found their way onto the database?
No, yes, they did. Yes, quite a few were done for individual projects, flora surveys, but also ditch surveys, and yeah, all sorts. You're quite right. All sorts of organisations, including the Wildlife Trust, the Environment Agency, the National Trust, Natural England. I mean, the list is endless, really. Yeah,
Okay.
quite right.
In that first presentation, it said there were many more species on the website than in the books. How did you decide what to keep out of the books?
Well, briefly, this is all in the introduction, which is available in the book and online. The 631 additional species online. It came down to really excluding aliens that weren't in 50 hectads or fewer over all time. So it's the rarer aliens which are in the online atlas, which aren't in there.
Can I quickly ask about whether Princeton were surprised at the interest, and also related to that, whether they reported large international interest?
Yes, I don't know about the international interest, but yeah, the head of global marketing spoke to me the other day. A very important man, I'm sure. And he was thinking that they might pre-sell 100 copies, and they pre-sold 1,000. So he was over the moon. They're very, very happy.
Well, thank you, Pete, for providing us with an insight into the scale of this phenomenal achievement.
Thank you.